Okay, so today I'm going to be covering houses and the passive and active benefits that a house will confer upon the player in it. Now, while some may appear readily apparent, such as a fellow house member sending you goods when you request it in a faction thread, others are a bit more implicit, and if you do not look closely, you may not acknowledge their existence. So, for starters, the differences between a house and a faction. A faction is a group of players who have bonded together for a common cause, whereas a house is a group of factions that have bonded together for a common cause, namely the glory race. To gain glory, you need to be in a house. This necessitates the formation of houses from usually geographically close factions. So the pros of joining a faction, and by way of joining a faction, joining a house, since you as a player cannot directly join a house, are both implicit and explicit, as I said. Some of the pros would be protection. Now this is something more implicit. Basically, when you join a house, you will be adopting their diplomatic stance with other houses in the game. This means that if your house is at war with other houses, so will you, or even specific players. However, on the upside of this also means that you are not fair game. You have a network behind you who is prepared to defend you if necessary if you are unreasonably attacked. So if you hold a parish or something, if you hold villages, being in a house will help protect all that. Because basically, if someone goes up against you without valid reason, the entire house is there to protect your rights and interests in the game, because that is sort of the cause. It's like being part of a country. You know, the people in the country elect their officials, and then the officials make deals with other officials from other countries. That's basically what a house is. You have elected officials. They are making deals with other houses for the best interests of their house and their players. So protection is an implicit benefit to being in a house, because it's important to realize that simply by being in a faction will not protect you in the same way that a house will. Since your faction being in a house will place your house colors around your parishes and around your villages, it is more likely that you will be overlooked when looking for targets, because most players looking for targets will ignore a house player due to the ramifications of attacking that player, especially if they themselves are in a house. You know, this can lead to tensions between the two houses and result in the troublemaking player getting kicked for causing you trouble to begin with. That is why we have higher ranking officers to make those diplomatic decisions. This is not a decision that just an average player in the faction will make. So some of the more explicit aspects to joining a house, or benefits to joining a house, would be growth. Now, what I mean by growth is the ability for you and your house members to help each other out and basically assist in the overall growth of your parishes and villages. By growing your parishes and villages fast, you know, you're helping out the entire house, so it's in everyone's best interest to make sure all members' needs are being met. Growth can take form in several ways, but the most explicit form would be simply sending goods to another player who requests them. Another pro to joining a house would be the ability for more veteran players to teach you tactics and strategies of the game. Now, people who've been playing the game could have years of experience on you, and a lot of them are able to teach you invaluable lessons about how the game works. If you do not join a faction, if you do not join a house, you are basically left on your own to figure it all out yourself, and there is a wealth of information that you could readily benefit from simply by joining a house. Finally, I would like to mention that by joining a house, you will have a greater sense of purpose in playing the game. Sure, you could play the game just to remove the AI, or hopefully, remain steward of your own little fiefdom, but eventually the game will get boring in this sense, and you'll probably end up quitting. If you join a house, or if you join a faction, and by way of a faction join a house, you will most likely be in the glory race, and most houses in the glory race will be competing with each other. There will be a few farming houses, but they are not nearly as prevalent as the houses actively seeking glory. This gives you sort of a greater cause, and more incentive to actually play the game. if there are going to be other people who you are collaborating with to achieve goals. And I mean that is sort of the essence of what an MMO is. And Stronghold Kingdoms is an MMO. Being an MMO is as inherent to the nature of Stronghold Kingdoms as it being a war game, a player versus player war game. If you do not join a house, you are missing out on a great deal of what Stronghold Kingdoms has to offer. Finally, I think I should mention a couple of the cons to joining a house. If you join a house, as I mentioned before, I'm getting a little tired of having to mention, if you join a faction, and by way of joining a faction, you join a house. So I'm just going to refer to it from now on as joining a house. Anyway, joining a house attaches rigid diplomacy. You are no longer free to negotiate diplomacy on your own. Your house is the sole arbiter of diplomacy. You can attempt to influence their diplomatic decisions, but ultimately it's not up to you, and you are not authorized to make sort of backroom deals with players in exchange for immunity from them or something. In other words, if your house is at war with another house, you are not permitted to make deals with players in that house for assured mutual protection. The house rules, while some could consider diplomacy a rule, it extends beyond the realm of just diplomacy. Some houses are more libertarian in terms of what you are allowed to do, but most of them have strict guidelines, such as not attacking other houses, not attacking neutrals. Maybe you can attack neutral parishes. Other houses will say neutrals are fair game. We really don't care whether they're on our side or not. We're going to crush them all. So it will vary by house, but again, these house rules need to be followed if you wish to remain within the house and obtain the benefits being in a house can provide you with. Now, new players, especially, joining a house in the first age is much more important than later on ages, and this is because when you first start out, like this world right here, USA 3, it is currently in day 22, but when I first started out, it was day 2, I believe. And if I hadn't joined a house, there would be a lot of players of a somewhat equivalent rank to me, and I am fair game because I wouldn't be affiliated with a house. And if I didn't join one, these players would actively scout me, attack me, raid my parishes because I'm not affiliated. And the best way to stop those attacks is by joining a house. Now, the reason that this isn't as big a problem in later ages is because, namely, most parishes have been claimed, and you won't be claiming one early on. Most parishes are developed. This means there is less need for flags, and therefore there are fewer players who are going to be raiding other parishes for their flags. And finally, because a lot of players are going to be higher ranked than you, the honor cost to just harass somebody with attacks who is much lower ranked is generally not worth it. If you are minding your own business, princes and princesses will leave you alone if you're only a thane. However, for the first age, if you start out right away in a new world, everyone's basically on the same level, and the downside to capturing you, the honor cost, is not significant enough to deter bigger players from attacking you. When choosing a house to join, it is important to make two distinctions. There are basically houses that are in it for a glory race, and then there are houses that are not. The houses that are in it for the glory are usually fighting houses, whereas the ones that stay back and sort of do their own thing are generally considered farming factions. Although this might not necessarily be the case all the time. They could just be training factions, they could be sister houses, it can vary. But when you are looking to join a house, it is important that you know which one you're getting into. I like to go by chain of command. This is how I recommend you finding a house. Start with your steward. If you spawn in a parish that already has a steward, contact that steward and request, some additional information about the house that he or she is currently in. Now, it's important to remember that if this is a steward of a house that does not hold a majority in that county, the county is a collection of parishes, you might be better off looking for a different steward, as this one could have potential conflicts down the road if they get in trouble with the predominant house. I always recommend going with the predominant house in a new world, especially if you are unfamiliar with Stronghold Kingdoms politics. So if the steward cannot help you, try going a rank above that and contacting your sheriff. It is sort of your sheriff's duty to make sure that all the players are taken care of. If your county doesn't have a sheriff yet, you could go to the faction that you're interested in joining, one that holds a majority stake in that county. Okay, contact all their officers. One of the officers should be a recruiting officer, and hopefully one of the officers you contact will either be the recruiting officer or can refer you right away to the officer who is in charge of recruitment. But getting back to the fighter-farmer dynamic, once you have settled on a faction that you want to join, be upfront and honest with your past experiences with the game. If you haven't played much, a farming faction would likely be the ideal faction for you, or a training faction. However, especially in New Worlds, fighting factions are predominant because the players who generally spend cards needed to get a high rank and start a faction right away tend to be in it for the glory race, So the early factions that start out will be fighting factions, and it is okay to solicit an invite from them as long as you make your personal experience transparent to them. And you might want to request that they move you into a training faction after they get that one established due to your lack of experience in the game, and that or a lack of a desire to fight right away. If you want to build up a bit more, request that you are put into a training faction. It is usually better when it's an entirely different house because it can hold different diplomacy with the rest of the houses. So if the main fighting house goes to war, the training house can remain at peace to an extent. If there was too much collaboration between the two, you would probably be on the receiving end of some attacks, but it varies a bit. Those are some of my thoughts on joining a house and why I consider it mandatory or essential to your Stronghold Kingdoms experience. You can obviously get away with not joining a house, but the pros outweigh the cons for joining one, and you'll have a lot more fun working with other players than you will on your own, even if you're somewhat introverted. Giving credit where credit is due, I owe my house quite a bit. Did a lot of passive benefits, like I said, and I just wanted to give a shout out to them in USA 3. So thank you guys, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.
Stronghold Kingdoms. The battle has just begun.